Good morning and welcome to the Home Affairs Select Committee. I apologise for starting slightly late this morning. We've got two panels in our final session on fraud. The aims for this session are to examine the UK's response to fraud and the impact of serious fraud offences and fraud against the public sector, to understand what the government is doing to combat the scale of fraud in the UK, and to examine the effectiveness of the government's counter-fraud policies, including the fraud strategy and the economic crime plan. We're also very mindful that there was a fraud summit that was held earlier this week, and we're looking forward to hearing about that. Can I ask our witnesses this morning to introduce themselves? Mr Fell, would you like to start first?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Simon Fell. I'm the MP for Baroness. I'm the Prime Minister's anti-fraud champion, and I guess for clarity and completeness, I should say I'm also a member of this committee, and I've recused myself from this inquiry.
Thank you. Cheeseman.
My name is Mark Cheeseman, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Government's new Public Sector Fraud Authority, which works with government departments and public bodies to better understand and increase the impact of our action against fraud in the public sector.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Ephgrave. I'm the Director of the Serious Fraud Office, which is a national organisation that's designed to combat serious and complex fraud, bribery and corruption, usually international bribery and corruption.
Thank you. Perhaps if we could start with you, Mr Fell.
Indeed.
In your role as the anti-fraud champion for the Prime Minister, could you just give the committee a flavour of where you think we are now in terms of fraud, whether the government is finally taking fraud seriously? There seems to have been a very long delay in getting a fraud strategy out. So could you just give us a flavour of what your take is on that?
So I think when you're in a situation where you have such a prevalent crime as fraud, it's 38% of all crime at the moment, we're clearly not in the place we need to be. And the fraud strategy is a recognition of that. You know, we need to change the way we approach fraud, what we do to pursue fraudsters, the way we look after victims, the way we make the system work better together. And everything in that strategy is about delivering the sort of changes we need to make the system work better. There's a huge amount of work coming out of that. I'll rattle through the sort of key points in it. You mentioned we had an international summit yesterday. 70% of the fraud that we see in the UK has an international component. We are not ever going to be able to answer the question of how we deal with fraud if we just focus on the UK. We need to get data shared across countries. We need to get law enforcement working together so we can better pursue the criminals who are actually causing these harms. But at the same time, we also need to bring industry on board. So 10 years ago, before I was an MP, I worked in fraud prevention. 10 years ago, we would have never talked about bringing social media companies into the conversation. Actually, as we've heard in this committee, a good amount of the fraud that is committed in the UK begins or is perpetrated across these social media platforms. So getting them round the table, working with them, getting them sharing data, helping law enforcement, better protecting victims, allowing them to users to report fraud on their platforms. These are all key outcomes of the fraud strategy and part of the online charter which we've managed to get over the line with a good number of these companies. We're improving the victim response. You know, we've got the National Fraud Squad now, so 400 officers in post. There'll be 500 by the end of 2025. All of this is about changing the dynamic on fraud. And despite the fact we've got all this great work going on, if you look at each of these pockets in isolation, they'll make a small difference to the bigger picture. I think the learning is there is no one silver bullet to this. It is about an entire systems change. And the fraud strategy, I think, is a really good step towards that. But when we deliver all the actions in it, that's not it, job done. Fraudsters innovate, they look for holes in the system, they look to exploit wherever they possibly can. So we have to keep iterating and working together. And it's about finding new partnerships, finding where the next vulnerabilities are, and then changing the system again and again and again.
Can you say something about data sharing? Because this is an issue that we've come across a lot in our inquiry. There's a lot of talk about how, you know, we are very good, institutions are good at data sharing, But are we really? Isn't there a major problem with actual data sharing, particularly with the international issue that you've raised, that so much of fraud comes from overseas? Are we really good at getting that data sharing?
You raise a really good point. I think we have a number of really good, in the UK, data sharing schemes up and running. I declare an interest. I used to work for one of them before I was in Parliament. They collate data from across industry, they share it with law enforcement so it can be used in anger against criminals, so that victims can be better protected. That is part of the infrastructure now of policing and of fraud prevention. And it is quite a successful industry as well. You can see absolute results from the sharing of that data and the use of that data. But you're right, the international component is absolutely key here, and it's also learning where fraud is evolving and where it is moving to. So, I mentioned tech firms in my previous answer. We need to learn from those companies. What are they seeing? At what point in the fraud value chain, from an account being hijacked to a fraud being either enabled or taking place on a platform to money leaving someone's account, what signals are going across that value chain? Where can that data most usefully be shared and in what format? And we need to step up systems to make that happen. That doesn't happen overnight. We've got to be really careful when we enable these things because there are concerns about data protection, people's privacy, decisions being made about people's lives based on information across that piece. But there's a huge amount of work in the fraud strategy and with law enforcement to get that right. And then we start to look at the overseas component as well and making sure that when these gangs, so as I said, 70% of fraud has an international component. When you see the monies travelling overseas, we've got to make sure that law enforcement has the legal ability to talk to its partner organisations in other countries so you can follow that money, you can go after the gangs.
And I think it was our very first session we had on romance fraud, and we heard evidence from a victim that she found it incredibly difficult in terms of the international dimension in that case to actually know what was happening, to feel that it was all being taken seriously by all the law enforcement agencies involved, and it wasn't just one country, it was several. I mean, I think that evidence was quite powerful, that those links were not there, were not working in that particular case.
Yeah, and it's fair to say we've got a long way to go on this, and the reason we have spent the last 3 days having a global summit on fraud was to talk to other nations who are experiencing exactly the same challenges that we are, at the same sort of scale we are, to get them into a place where they are prepared to work with us, to share data, to understand where data protection rules and disclosure rules get in the way of decent results happening in this space. And I've got to say, I was absolutely surprised by the amount of cooperation that these countries offered. They are leaning into the same challenges. They recognise that we've got a shared solution that we need to get to, so they want to work with us on it.
And did you get some hard outcomes from that summit? Because I've been looking at some of the in the communique. There's lots of commitments to develop a better understanding of the fraud threat and strengthen multilateral partnerships and grow capabilities. Commitments to strengthen victim support and support victims, commitment to increase data intelligence sharing. So that all sounds very positive, but are there hard outcomes from that summit that you've actually will be delivered by countries?
So, they were good outcomes because this is the first of its kind. We've never had a global fraud summit like this before. They came around the table. We brought some of the biggest tech companies in the world round that table as well, law enforcement round that table. We clearly want to move in the same direction, but this is the first step in that journey. What we've done now is build up relationships which we will be taking forwards in the next weeks and months to start to make tangible differences, to talk about what that data sharing looks like, how we get bits of law enforcement to work together, how we going back to my analogy about the value chain, how we work with those tech companies and telcos and others to understand what we need from them. But this is the start of what I hope will be a really fruitful
And I think we're going to have some questions on social media companies and what exactly they're doing or not doing. Mr. Cheeseman, could I just ask you a question in terms of the problems with prosecutions? And I think the general public would want to see where this public sector fraud, as many prosecutions brought forward as possible. But we know that less than 1% of fraud offences against individuals are prosecuted by the CPS, and the UK criminal justice system is already, well, in severe difficulty. There's huge numbers of backlogs of cases. So can you offer any reassurance about bringing people to book for public sector fraud?
Of course. You heard from Richard Lass a few weeks ago from Revenue and Customs, which is one of the biggest areas looking at fraud against the public sector in the tax system, and from some of the action they're taking on prosecuting those who commit fraud. The Department for Work and Pensions also prosecutes people who commit fraud working with the CPS. So prosecutions do happen, and action is taken. It's not something actually that historically we've collected data on, but the Public Sector Fraud Authority, since across the whole system of the public sector, but the Public Sector Fraud Authority, since coming in, has now started collecting data to public body by public body on the level of prosecutions and pieces that are going on there. And that's quite a big task with hundreds of public bodies we're looking at there. But that will enable us to bring this picture. But the thing I'd like to just draw to is while some prosecutions are important to bring people to justice and a deterrent effect, investigating economic crime is quite expensive. And actually there are a range, again you heard from Richard Lass, there's a range of different approaches we take. So firstly we'll do compliance work and other sanctions, and government departments will do work exploring other types of sanctions in their policies and their contracts that they can take where they suspect fraud. But secondly, and one of the real focuses of the Public Sector Fraud Authority is on how you prevent. So how you take those learnings to build better systems, stronger processes, to design out as much of the fraud as possible. And earlier this year, the year before, 2023, the Public Sector Fraud Authority launched a risk, threat and prevention service which works with public bodies to really understand those risks and get more prevention in, using tools like data and data sharing, as you've touched on already.
And which are you able to point the committee to departments or organisations that are doing well on fraud in terms of finding it, investigating it, prosecuting it?
So the two big parts of the public sector that focus on that are the Department for Work and Pensions and Revenue and Customs. So if we look at them, they have 84% of the resourcing, and that's where the main risk and threat lies. So that makes sense and is quite aligned. So if I was looking at the places that are really pushing on that, it's there first and foremost. Outside of that, we publish a fraud landscape report every year which details what level of fraud is being found. The government has an active policy to find more fraud, because by finding fraud we can deal with it better, we can better prevent, we can better understand the attacks, and we have steadily increased the level of detected, recovered and prevented fraud since that started being reporting. And in that report it will break it down by department as to where fraud is being found. Once we have the prosecution's data, we can then align that to that as well.
Sorry, you haven't got the prosecution data yet?
No, so we have introduced this year starting collecting prosecutions data.
Yeah.
What was collected previously was the level of detected fraud to the civil balance, so where someone's suspected on the balance of probabilities there may have been fraud.
Okay, and what do you say about the huge backlogs in court cases?
So that's a challenge wider in the system. There is a challenge there, and I know the government's working on it. It's not one of my areas to look at, but I think that I would come back to that point of actually it's not just about prosecutions through the criminal system.
Okay.
There are a range of actions to deter fraud, and we won't deal with the volume crime against the public sector or other sectors just through that route. It's about diversifying that approach.
I think the committee accepts that
Cool.
You need to prevent that. That's, we know we can't prosecute our way out of this, but I think for the public sector, I think the general public will want to see people brought to book, particularly for public sector fraud. I think that seems to me very, very clear. Thank you very much. Can I just turn to you, Mr. Ephgrave, now, about the Crime in Courts Act 2013. And that allows the Director General of the NCA to direct you on matters relating to the investigation of suspected incidents of serious or complex fraud, bribery and corruption. the government have said they're going to amend the Courts Act, the Crime and Courts Act 2013. So in the same way that the NCA has power to direct the police in relation to serious and organised crime. So I just wondered, could you say something about that, so how that will affect the Serious Fraud Office having that direction?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a recent amendment, as you rightly say, and a lot of thought has gone into it. I think the way I look at that is it's one of these, if I can use an analogy, it's a bit like by a fire escape where you have break glass if in an emergency. It's that kind of provision. So one would imagine, and I certainly am in discussions with my colleagues in the NCA, we are very much of the view that this is something that really shouldn't have to be used, because we ought to be able to get around the table, and the NEC, the National Economic Crime Centre, is the place where these discussions would naturally take place. We should be able to get around the table and find between us the right way to deal with whatever the nature of the threat is. And I'm certainly not slow in coming forward in terms of accepting referrals from other agencies. I've got a good track record in the short time I've been here. Open 5.
Why are they thinking they need to bring that in and amend the bill, amend the Act? So, sorry, why is the government deciding to do this if it's a kind of, only in really difficult circumstances? If you're saying it's all fine and you take referrals.
I think it's sensible to have a provision should there be a disagreement, but at the moment we haven't reached that position, and I'd like to think that in the collaborative approach I'm taking with working with not just the NCA but domestic police forces would mean that we wouldn't need recourse to such a sort of a mandation. But it's always sensible to have a provision if that were ever to happen.
Okay, is this historic then? Have there been problems in the past before you arrived?
Not aware of any, but I've been in the job for 5 months, so my knowledge of the deep history of the SFO is limited.
Okay. And so you've only been there 5 months. Do you think you've got enough resources to effectively investigate serious fraud?
Well, I think my job is to make the best of what I have, and I've got a team of about 600 people, and my job, as defined in the Statement of Principle, is very, very specific. It's international bribery, corruption, serious and complex fraud, where there is significant harm intended or caused to either the public in general, the economy and prosperity of this country, or its reputation as a safe place to do business. So it's a fairly tight set of criteria. Of course, one could always do more with more, but that's the same for every public sector. Every public service would say that. I think the thing I need to focus on is driving the best outcomes I can with whatever I'm given. I will always articulate the case for why it's sensible to invest in the SFO. I think it's right to say that we provide good value for money. If you look at our return on investment, if you like, for the last 5 years, it's about 3 to 1. So for every £1 that's been invested in the SFO, we've delivered £3 of benefit back to the Treasury. So we're certainly a good value for money organisation. But my principal aim is, with whatever I've got, let's make sure I deliver the most I can with it.
Okay, make the best of what you've got. I think you just said, didn't you? And whatever you're given. That doesn't exactly sound to me like you're saying, yes, I've got sufficient resources to do the job, the important job that I've been given. Well,
we've heard the scale of the fraud threat. I have to apply criteria and I have to prioritise cases because I have a limited amount of resource. I mean, as I said, that's the same for everyone that runs a public service. And there's always an argument to ask for more. You can do more with more. That's an obvious point to make. But I'm very alive to the fact that there are competing demands for a limited amount of money. And I think I probably use a clumsy phrase. What I'm trying to say is I just need to make sure that the resources I have under my command are directed in the most efficient and effective way. That's probably a better way of saying what I tried to say earlier.
Can I just ask, the additional resources through the fraud strategy, do you get any of that? I'm thinking the 400 investigators, are any of those going into your organisation?
The National Fraud Squad that's been referred to, those 400 investigators, they are a separate entity. They sit in a different environment, but we can work alongside those people. I mean, it doesn't mean we can't work together. It's a relatively new innovation, as we've heard, so we're working to see how that can help us, but they're not directly coming to the SFO.
Okay, right. Lawton.
Mr. Fell, yours is a pretty new role, and you took over quite quickly from your predecessor.
Indeed.
Is it a meaningful role?
Well, I very much hope so.
Well, so do we, but is it?
Yes, I think so. We've got this fraud strategy. It needs delivering. My job is to make sure that we keep that motoring along. But more than that, it's about making sure that we are looking at new opportunities and we continue to move as the threat moves too.
But with respect to your own position, the government's appointed lots of champions over over many years, although I don't think I've been a champion of anything officially, but there's no real official status to it, is there? What do you have access to that any other MP doesn't effectively have access to?
I've got a team of fantastic officials, some of whom are sat behind me right now, and the weight of the Home Office. So I've been empowered by the Prime Minister to work with Home Office, Ministry of Justice across government to bear down on the challenge of fraud. And I've got to say, in the short time I've been in post, I haven't found any challenge in getting doors opened or to find people who are willing to work with me, because this is a priority of the government.
What does access across government actually mean, though? Because you're primarily working with the Home Office, aren't you? Are all your officials based in the Home Office?
Yes.
And yet fraud is a big responsibility within Treasury and various other departments as well. So how practically real is joined-up government across those departments, or is this really a Home Office-driven thing?
Well, it's a Home Office strategy, but it's a government strategy as well, and there are agreed measures in there. So it's about getting them over the line and making sure that, where there are points of friction, I can reach out and talk to other ministers and make sure that they are aligned. If we are seeing a particular challenge, I can sort of bridge that gap, and I can take some of the weight off the Security Minister and the rest of the team and just focus on fraud for the PM.
But notwithstanding your own suitability for the job, should it really be a ministerial post that we have a full-blown cross-cutting minister for fraud at a high level?
Well, I think there's a very strong case for that. I'm not looking for that job, and I'm not entirely sure it's in your gift to give it to me either.
We could give you a good write-up in the report there.
and that would be very much appreciated. But in all honesty, whilst there is a clear value in connecting Treasury and Home Office, I'm not seeing a disconnect there since I've been in post. We're aligned on this strategy. The whole of government is aligned on this strategy, and the last couple of days have shown that, where we've had representatives from across government working with international partners. No one's been dragging their feet on getting this stuff over the line.
And this great fraud summit that's taken place the last couple of days, what are the takeaways from that been? Has it achieved anything apart from a few communiques and photo opportunities?
Well, I think the key thing is that we now have willing international partners who are willing to take those next steps with us. So on better protecting victims, on looking at international data flows, on going after the criminal gangs responsible, on finding common ground on new areas like tech, where we can work together and agree a common approach to how we engage with some of these companies. None of that was in place before, and it's up to us now to take that forwards.
You said earlier that we have some good data sharing schemes of which you were a part, but in the private sector. Do you think that the public sector is learning enough from the private sector, or are they two very different spheres?
I'm straying somewhat out of my brief if I answer that, so Mark may want to step in.
I'm very happy to come in on the public sector fraud and how we deal with that, and working with the private sector. I mean, we absolutely are learning from the private sector. Could we do more? Will we challenge ourselves to do more? Always. But for instance, our partners in the Public Sector Fraud Authority, we've gone out and openly procured partners. We have a range of partners from the private sector. We've had secondees into our organisation from the banks. We have an advisory panel who advise the leadership team, which Simon himself sits on, and other people from other sectors and other countries in other sectors sit on, to bring this richness of experiences from other spaces and this challenge to us and to the public sector in terms of how we're doing it. As we build capability, which is something I think so important, how we build the capability and people to understand and deal with fraud in the public sector, that itself, the government counter-fraud profession, has a cross-sector advisory group on which the private sector sit, the charity sector sit, other sectors sit, to advise and challenge us on how we're building that, and to make sure we're not just building it with blinkers on, but we're looking out and thinking about those broader experiences.
So what good lessons and good examples have we adopted from the private sector who've been doing this probably more intensively for longer than it's become on the radar of public sector agencies.
So I think the use of data and analytics and how you can use that, certainly from the banking sector and other sectors. We do quite a lot with data and analytics, and just announced we'll have £34 million more in investment for the Public Sector Fraud Authority to do more with data and analytics to find and prevent fraud. And that is very much building off, as I said, the experience we've seen in banking and insurance and in other sectors as to how they've harnessed their data to look for and prevent fraud.
I mean, going back to the old days when I was in the city and involved in the financial world, and in the days where we had a partnership stock exchange, we had something called the Stock Exchange Mutual Reference Society, which was a sort of very early basic forerunner of anti-fraud, whereby whenever we took on a new client in stockbroking, we had to refer them to the Stock Exchange Mutual Reference Society so that any other stock exchange financial firm could check their records, and if they'd been somebody who'd legged it owing them some money or done some suspected insider trading or whatever it may be, we were tipped off, you shouldn't deal with that person. Or when there were sort of collaborating bits of evidence, then it could be referred to the police if there were suggestions that this person was potentially a criminal as well. And it worked really well before the days of technology and everything, but it actually worked. Now we've got technology and all the AI assisted and things that we've got, that sort of thing should be so much easier, shouldn't it? And yet it's such a bigger problem. Are we sort of missing the wood for the trees because we're not sharing and comparing data with the most relevant agencies?
So we could do more of it. It is a big world with a lot of organisations, a lot of public bodies, a lot of private sector organisations looking at it in different ways. So I'm not saying we can't do more, but there is a lot of activity going on. One of the challenges with public sector fraud is the diversity of it. So it could be welfare fraud, tax fraud, it could be fraud against grant schemes, internal fraud in the public sector, fraud in procurement or contract management. It's incredibly diverse. And if you think about the use of data from other sectors, I mean, the example you gave, we did some work sharing known fraud data with other sectors and looking at how we could use that. So where were known fraudsters in the system? Very helpful in some examples, but actually known fraudsters access the health service, access welfare benefits if they're entitled, if their earnings are of such. So we have to use that data and those tools in a way which is targeted towards the problem that we experience and the diversity of it in the public sector.
Mr. Ephgrave, the Serious Fraud Office, is there a clue in the title, it deals with serious fraud?
That's right.
But the vast majority of fraud is affecting our constituents every day, people who are scammed out of hundreds or thousands of pounds paying for services or goods or whatever that don't appear. Are you only really concerned with the big stuff, and are we actually then missing resource and application to the more common stuff, which some could say actually causes much more disruption and misery to ordinary people than to corporates or whatever who take it in their stride?
I think you're right to say that we deal with a small proportion of the totality. That's absolutely right. I've mentioned earlier the statement of principle, we call it, by which I need to decide which investigations we take on and which we don't. And that statement of principle does talk about harm caused or intended. And I have to think about not so much individuals, but the collective harm to the public in general, or the economy of this country, or its reputation as a safe place to do business, which takes me into the bribery and corruption part, which is not necessarily relevant here. So in looking at those, and the final element of the criteria that has to be there is the nature of the fraud is such that only the SFO with its specialist skills, and I'll come to that in a minute, and the powers only the SFO has, are the only agency that can deal. It's all of those criteria need to apply before we take an investigation on. But to give you an example of the scale, so a recent example of an investigation we adopted, which is in the public arena, so I can talk about it, is the collapse of the Safe Hands funeral care service. 46,000 ordinary, hard-working people who mostly retired, mostly thought they were making a very safe and prudent investment to provide for their families after their death and so on, had their money stolen. That's what it amounted to, 46,000 people. So that's the kind of harm collectively that will bring that fraudulent activity into the world that I'm interested in. And the other thing perhaps to say about the SFO in terms of its specialist skills, which is not always apparent and you wouldn't necessarily know it if you didn't read it up, is that we're the only organisation that has both investigative and prosecutorial powers. So as the director, I'm charged with both deciding which investigations I take on and, having investigated them, which I then prosecute. So my cases don't go to the CPS, they are entirely handled in-house. And that was something that Lord Roskill devised way back in the 1980s when he reported on the then government's response to fraud.
And do you think that works well?
I think the multidisciplinary team is a really important element of what we do. Because our cases necessarily take quite a long time, almost all of our cases are multi-jurisdictional. We've already heard from Mr. Fell that so much fraud is international, but particularly the types of fraud I deal with. And so having forensic accountants, having lawyers and having investigators, as well as data analytic experts and tech people within the team, provides me with the best opportunity, I think, to exploit the opportunities that the investigation presents without having to go and find those people that you might have to do if you are in a domestic police force.
So is that a model that the police force could actually look at if it's worked so well with you?
Well, the model was designed to cope with the very top end, the very complex, the very long, the lengthy investigations we have, and as I said, the multi-jurisdictional nature. Of course, in the volume crime world, having as a former chief constable, I understand this. One also works very closely with the CPS, but they're not part of the same organisation. There's absolutely designed to be a sort of a corridor between the two organisations. So the investigation is conducted by the police, it's then gone to the CPS who consider the evidence and make a decision. And that model works very, very well for the vast majority of offending in this country. The specialism I have was designed to deal with the particular complexities of serious and complex fraud, bribery and corruption.
But do you measure that compared to the police and the CPS, of which obviously we've had a lot of experience, not least with sexual crime and the low prosecution rate? And is it down to the police not investigating properly and passing on poor cases? It's down to the CPS not properly getting the information across, or whatever. Do you think, therefore, your success rate in terms of that a much higher number of the cases you investigate then end up in prosecutions, successful or other, or is your threshold higher so that you don't investigate so much unless it's much more serious, and you don't proceed it unless it's much more serious, or vice versa? How I'm just a measure of how it compares when it's a one-stop shop, or whatever you want to call it, that you're operating.
It's a very interesting question because whenever you specialise, whenever you create a group of people whose sole job is quite well defined and quite specialist, and you invest resources and expertise in it, you tend to get better results. And I think that's what differentiates any specialist police unit or my teams from the generalist, the PC that goes to investigate low-level theft or something. They're a one-person band. I have the advantage of having a bunch of experts, legal experts, forensic experts, investigative experts, who can focus all of their intellectual energy and effort and experience on this one case, and that tends to produce better results. But of course it's an expensive model, which means we can only take on a limited number of cases, and I think to try and expand that model into volume crime would create enormous resourcing implications.
Okay, thank you.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I've got some questions around social media companies, because lots of the evidence that we've heard is that not just that frauds are being committed via social media, but the organised crime is actively using social media in order to perpetrate those crimes. And I wonder if you perhaps, if you could each comment, I suppose, on what responsibilities these social media companies ought to be taking for what's being perpetrated on their platforms.
Well, I probably have a particularly limited view on this. I'm an investigator and a prosecutor, so we tend to respond to what we get referred. But we do see the use of social media as a propagator for some of the scams and the investment frauds in particular that we see. So I think the point that was being made earlier about prevention and education of that sector is a really important point, and it came up actually. I was lucky enough to be at the Global Fraud Summit, and we had a number of representatives from the social media companies who recognised their responsibilities to do what they could to provide security to the people that use those platforms. There's always more that can be done. An interesting thing to be thought about is whether the new failure to prevent fraud provision in the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that's just been passed. Whether that would have the reach to go into companies that provide services which aren't necessarily financial services, but actually are a platform for the propagation of fraud. So that's something that will need to be thought about and tested.
Yeah. I mean, the risk assessment of the failure to prevent the fraud offence suggested that very few cases were actually brought before the courts on that. And do you think that's going to be effective enough?
Well, it remains to be seen. It's only just gone onto the statute because I'm determined to be the first person to do it, and that's my goal. I can't predict which case it will be, but I'm looking for it right now.
So I think you're absolutely right. These platforms are used by criminals. We know that fraudsters operate on them. They target people on them. I think this isn't just a social media issue. We see it across all kinds of industries. But we also see an incredibly wide range of frauds running across these platforms. So, we heard compelling evidence around romance fraud and the impact that has on people's lives. That is a very, very different crime to someone trying to drive you off platform to a secure communication service so you can then send money as part of a financial fraud of a different sort. And we need to tackle them differently, but it's about understanding the signals in the system, and it's about getting these companies to come to the table and act responsibly and work with partners in law enforcement and across other industries and with government too. And I think we're in a reasonable place with them. We've certainly got a long way to go, but we signed this online fraud charter a few months ago with them, and they voluntarily, wide range of organisations, some of the biggest tech companies in the world, voluntarily came to the table to enact measures which will take them time, effort, cost them money, and potentially drive down some of their revenue as well in doing so. And I think we've got to take them at face value on that. And in 2 months' time, when the charter kicks in proper, let's see what the results are. And if they don't deliver, obviously, excuse me, that gives us an opportunity to go back and have some more robust conversations with them. But we also have the Online Safety Act coming in at that point, where the provisions which Ofcom is consulting on at the moment will kick in, and then there are the opportunities for really quite substantial fines to be levied against these companies if they don't act properly on fraud and some of the other stuff we see on their platforms.
Yeah. You mentioned if they don't deliver, how will you be measuring that delivery against the charter?
So that's part of what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm doing roundtables with all of these tech firms, checking up on their progress against the objectives in the online fraud charter. We're looking at the metrics so we can get from them, when they put in customer authentication, when they put in 2 clicks away from reporting a fraud in their system, what does that actually do in terms of changing user behaviour? What are they seeing in terms of the amounts of frauds reported? Those sorts of things. But this is a first step. So if we don't see changes in the amount of fraud running across these platforms, if we don't see changes in consumer behaviour in the way that we hope we would, if we don't see less fraud on platforms, then obviously we'll be going back and having more conversations with them.
What kind of consequences would you envisage if they don't see a change?
Well, if they don't, so this is essentially a dry run for them. If they don't get this in their houses in order for this, they've got the Online Safety Act provisions coming in, at which point there are potentially swinging fines coming their way if they are not properly looking after their customers. They're not trying to prevent fraud on those platforms.
Because I've had the distinct impression, not just from Meta's evidence to this committee, but when I was in the Treasury Select Committee, we also looked at this issue, that they just weren't taking this as seriously. And the TSB and their evidence to us said that a third of their sampling in Facebook Marketplace, a third of the adverts on there were fraudulent, and Meta didn't really recognise that. Is that a problem that they don't recognise what the banks are seeing?
I think you'll probably always find a discrepancy between one company and another and what they say they're seeing. But we have seen, for instance, a pilot up and running between Meta and a couple of the banks where they're sharing data. They're trying to identify where fraud is happening and better drive that down. It's early days, but they're getting some decent results from that. We want to see that working across the whole system. But I do think they recognise the challenge they have. Otherwise, they wouldn't have signed up to this. Otherwise, they wouldn't be leaning into the Online Safety Act with some concern. They've got a very short period of time now to get their houses in order and demonstrate that they are moving in the right direction and taking this seriously. And if they don't, then they've got the full force of the law that's going to be holding them to account.
So it's not an area of my direct responsibility, but the public sector does have an angle on it, because these platforms can be used to either share methods to attack the public sector or to impersonate the public sector. And you heard last time from Richard Lass about some of the work HMRC's been doing in protecting the brand of Revenue and Customs in that, and how that's they've had good impact in that space. I mean, my answer would be that from my point of view as a fraud expert, all sectors have a role to play. I'm very supportive of the wider effort in the fraud strategy to encourage all sectors to have a role to play to protect both their users and, in the public sector's case, the public.
There was a File on 4 documentary a few years ago about people being recruited to be company directors via a Facebook group. That's obviously is related to the sort of vulnerability of UK corporate structures on this. Is HMRC alive enough to this, do you think?
So, I mean, the Economic Crime Transparency Act is reforming Companies House, and actually that's one of the areas the tools we were talking about earlier, one of the tools we've developed is sharing data from policing and the NCA and sanctions lists to help Companies House look at, under the Economic Crime and Transparency Act, how they make that register more robust.
Okay. But given the scale of information that's quite clearly guff on the Companies House register, is there enough resource going into tackling that?
I mean, that would be a question for that department and Companies House itself. We are there to assist them with tools that we can develop.
Okay. Do you feel that there's... I'm quite concerned about the kind of corporate structures facilitating fraud, in that way we saw that through COVID with companies being set up in order to get furlough payments or get PPE contracts. Is there enough scrutiny put upon that at the moment, and have we learned things from that experience?
So we're certainly learning from that experience. I mean, the platform that I've just talked about, the data analytics platform, was developed during the pandemic to deal with the type of frauds and challenges we were seeing. And part of the investment is to now create that to use in a business as usual setting to have more impact. So we're certainly learning our lessons and trying to do more. And I'll go back to what was said before as well, though. We don't have a static adversary. We have an adversary that will be agile. We will move the defences, and they will look to attack in a different way. So we can't just say, we're doing this, it's job done. It's always going to be a further effort to try and understand how we may be attacked, and then try and continually improve our defences.
Thank you. Mr. Fell, can I just ask you, one of the concerns the committee has is around terrorism and terrorists using fraud across the piece. We're a bit concerned that we don't think that that's getting the attention it deserves in all the documents and strategies that the government are putting out. What do you say about that?
Well, the fraud strategy directly acknowledges the link between fraud and more serious and organised crime, including terrorist financing. That's what the National Economic Crime Command within the NCA looks at. So we talked about data sharing earlier. Data from industry, from government, from law enforcement sits there and is interrogated by investigators so they can make those links, because you can see what might be considered to be a relatively low-level fraud connected through money laundering, connected through people trafficking, connected sometimes through modern slavery or county lines drugs running, is essentially a criminal enterprise running to fund some form of nefarious activity. And their job is to piece all this data together and then go after those worst offenders. So it's recognised in the strategy. It is a clear function of law enforcement to do that, and they have the people and the resource to go after that as well.
So you're saying you're satisfied that the government have got a handle on this?
I'm satisfied the government is very clear that this is an area of concern, and there is a function of law enforcement that looks at this, but we can certainly always be doing more, always.
Okay. Alison Thulis, do you
just
want to come back on that?
one brief question for Mr Ephgrave. I've heard in the past that it's difficult to both recruit and keep people on public sector wages. The expertise that you require to go after these folk, is that a concern for you?
It is a concern. It's something that doesn't just affect the Serious Fraud Office. We have to compete with the private sector. We have to compete with private law firms that can pay more money than us. I think what I try and sell to my people is the mission. You know, it really gets under your skin. If you really believe in what you're doing, then there are people that are very happy to accept they're not going to get paid quite as much as they might if they went into a private law firm to come work for the SFO. But what I want to try and generate in this country, which actually is very effective elsewhere, I've just come back from visiting colleagues in the US, and they have this system there, is a much greater sort of in and out movement of particularly lawyers coming into the SFO to work, to gain some public sector experience, to contribute to the fight against serious and organised crime, fraud, and then potentially move back into the private sector and then some years later come back in again. So there isn't such a great crossover as there is elsewhere, and that's something I'm quite keen to promote.
Yeah, in the US, I believe they're able to keep some of the proceeds from the crimes that they prosecute as well.
Individual prosecute.
Well, if you were to go after a big organised crime gang, you could keep some of the the money that you get back from that as well. Whereas in the UK, it's more of the risk on organisations like you to take those cases. Well, it would cost you more money to prosecute than you would ever see back.
Yeah, but we do clearly participate in asset recovery, and we do benefit from whatever we recover. We have an arrangement with Treasury, which I can provide you written details on, but it's based on the ARIS programme, which is the recycling of proceeds of crime. So we do benefit from that, as do all law enforcement agencies that recover assets. Yeah, the general point about recruitment and retention is definitely an issue that we've grappled with in the Serious Fraud Office over the years, and I'm very keen to try and bring some new thinking to that.
Thank you. Can I thank all three of you for attending this morning? I think that's very helpful. We're going to move to our second panel now with the ministers, but again, thank you for your time. Thank you.
I hope you'll forgive me, I've got a terrible cold, so I try not to disrupt your sessions.
But you won't get any sympathy from us there.
No, but I'm hoping I won't infect you either.
It won't work.
Well, welcome to our second panel this morning. This is our last session on our inquiry into fraud. I'm going to ask perhaps each of you to introduce yourselves. Would you like to start, Minister Tugendhat, just to introduce yourself?
I'm Tom Tugendhat, I'm the Security Minister.
I'm Charlotte Baroness Vere. I'm the Treasury Minister responsible for economic crime.
Thank you.
Anna Harvey. I'm a Deputy Director in the Financial Services Group in Treasury.
I'm Duncan Tessier. I'm the Director for Economic Crime in the Home Office.
Well, welcome. Perhaps I could start with you, Minister. Why has it taken 17 years to get the government to take fraud seriously? I note that it's 17 years since the publication of the Fraud Review in 2006, and we got the fraud strategy last year.
I think that's an excellent question. I'm afraid I was still in Helmand in 2006, so I'm afraid I can't answer it.
You speak for the government.
I do, and that's why in the last year since I've been in post, we've introduced the fraud strategy, and we've actually made the difference that quite rightly this committee has been asking for. And what we've also introduced, as you know, is a new National Fraud Squad, National Fraud Intelligence Unit, We have organised a fraud charter, and up until yesterday there was a global summit as well. So we've been doing an awful lot in the year that I've been in place. I'm afraid I can't answer for the Blair or the Brown administrations, and I wasn't there for the coalition administration from 10 to 15. So I'm afraid I'm somewhat limited in being able to answer, except for the last year or two.
Let's just for clarity, 2006 was a Labour government was in power, but from 2010 that's been a coalition, but Conservative all the way through.
Indeed.
So it's taken quite a long time for the Conservative government to get a grip on this.
Absolutely fair point. The Lib Dem Conservative administration that was in power then would have looked at this, no doubt. I'm afraid, again, I find it very difficult to answer because I'm still a soldier.
Okay. Do you think that COVID had an impact on this? Is that why the government woke up? Because fraud obviously increased during COVID.
Mike, can I just make a couple of comments on your first question, because I don't think it actually gets to the heart of the matter. The government has been taking fraud seriously for quite some time. What the fraud strategy did was to bring together all of the different strands. Now, if there's one thing I learned from the Global Fraud Summit yesterday, is my word, fraud is complicated, is international, it pervades all sorts of elements of our society and our economy. The fraud strategy was an opportunity to bring together all of those strands, but one only has to look back to, for example, 2017, the Payment Service Regulator brought in the requirement to reimburse victims. That was back in 2017. So lots of things have been happening. You know, the economic crime plan, that's the second economic crime plan. Again, economic crime, big picture, but part of that is fraud. So I think there has been a steady progression. There has been lots of good work happening in lots of different places, and as you will have heard from previous people, it is quite a fragmented picture, and the fraud strategy brings all that together.
Okay, so bits and pieces have been happening over time.
Well, slightly more than bits and pieces.
The fraud strategy brings it together.
It's an opportunity to bring it together, following on from Economic Crime Plan 2, where obviously cutting fraud was one of the three outcomes from that.
Okay, but I think it's fair to say that fraud has been given quite an impetus with the arrival of you, Minister.
Absolutely.
Tugendhat. I'd hope you'd recognise that.
He gets all the credit.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lola. I'm very grateful.
Can I just ask you about, I saw the comment, actually, that you gave yesterday, Minister, from the Global Fraud Summit, and you say the action we've taken has already reduced fraud by 13% in England and Wales.
That's right,
That's
yes.
in your quote. I think the committee is rather concerned about the statistics around fraud, because what we've discovered in our inquiry is that the vast majority of fraud isn't reported. So whilst there's a 13% drop in what has been reported, I think it's at least 1 in 7 offences.
Can I address that?
Not, yes, I want you to address that, because I'm just wondering if that's a little complacent to think fraud's going down, or that we must be doing everything right, when actually the vast majority isn't actually reported.
So I completely accept your point, and I think the statistics, though of course they can't be absolutely certain, are indicative of a direction that is important. Now, you mentioned COVID earlier, and I think it's an important thing to mention, because a lot of the world went online during COVID in a way that you could have done before, but a lot of people didn't. And we got used to shopping and trading and doing a whole bunch of things online that we had previously done in person. And so it's true to say that we saw a rise in online fraud, which for a lot of people, made fraud a lot easier, sadly, and made a lot more people victims of fraud. Now, I'm not going to pretend, it would be untrue to pretend, that every single fraud crime is reported. We know that's not true. But we also know that the direction during COVID was up. And we recorded it. We didn't record 100%, but we did record it. And since then, we've seen it down. Now, is it down exactly 13%, or is it down in the direction of about a tenth, a little over a tenth? I think I'd probably stick to a little over a tenth. The statistics are accurate in the sense that this is reported crime from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which, as you know, is the most reliable reporting of crime. But I think your point stands, which is that can't be absolutely nailed on as every single crime in the United Kingdom, but it definitely demonstrates the direction, just as the previous reports and the other statistics I'm sure you could mention would demonstrate a trend upwards. This demonstrates a trend downwards, and that, as you know, is a lot down to not just the work that the government's done, but also that many companies have done. And there's been a huge amount of cooperation with companies around the United Kingdom, including with banks and tech companies and telecoms companies, that has made that difference.
I think one of our concerns is about how easy it is for people to report fraud and the problems with action fraud and the new way that action fraud is going to operate. And I think we were particularly disappointed when we heard evidence on the 28th of February that the system is only going to be operational, the new system, from the end of the year. I just wondered, why is that? And what role have you played in making sure that that is up and running as quickly as possible? Because we know that's one of the problems, that people feel that there's no point reporting.
So, look, you raise an important question, and one of the things that I think is worth coming back to on this is that there is a difference between the effectiveness of action fraud and the reporting of crime that would come through action fraud. So anything that's reported through action fraud would count as one of those crimes in the crime survey in Wales, so that wouldn't affect the statistics. Your point about action fraud still stands, and it's an issue that we've been addressing, which is why we've asked the City of London Police to deal with this. We've given them £30 million, and we are putting a huge amount of encouragement if you're being positive, pressure if you're being slightly more negative, on the City of London Police to encourage them to make the changes that we need to see in action fraud. Now, I'd like to see them happen yesterday, but as you know, when bringing a major national campaign like this together, what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that you're bringing all of the police forces who need to cooperate with it, not simply the City of London Police, who of course have expertise and the lead on fraud in the United Kingdom.
This is like one of your flagship bits of the fraud strategy, isn't it? Having this new revamped action fraud. I don't quite understand why there's delays, because this isn't new stuff. We've always had police forces that you have to get their agreement to do various things with. So why is there a delay?
If I may, I think the flagship part of our fraud strategy is the sort of things we were talking about yesterday and the day before. It's that international cooperation and the cooperation between companies and between companies and government, between companies, government and law enforcement. That's really the flagship bit.
Well, can I just say that this committee is particularly concerned about the effect on victims of fraud. That's been one of our main reasons for doing this inquiry. Action fraud is a very important part of victims being able to report and feeling something is going to be done. And I think the problem for the committee is that we were told this was going to happen, then we're told there's a delay. It just doesn't feel like there is a focus on getting this right for victims.
If I may, Madam Chair, you have been absolutely leading in focusing on victims, and I pay huge tribute to your work on this. And one of the things that you've regularly said about victims is it's better to prevent anyone becoming a victim. And it's one of the issues that you have registered. So taking your lead, that is exactly what we've done. We've focused on prevention. We've focused on making sure companies come together to prevent fraud. We've focused on helping individuals to understand the threat of fraud. So you'll be aware of the campaign that we've just started, Stop, Think Fraud. And we've worked on bringing together partners from around the world, because as you know very well, some 70% of fraud is connected to overseas, and so that joint action is incredibly important.
But I don't think it's an either or. You can do both. You can do that international work, you can work with companies, you can do all of that, you can do the prevention work, but you need to have a functioning way of allowing victims to report fraud, and you haven't got that.
So I wouldn't agree with that statement. We do have a functioning way of reporting fraud, and action fraud does record fraud and it does report fraud. There are challenges with action fraud on further action. You're absolutely right. And that's why the things that make the biggest difference to action fraud now and help the capabilities that we would have wanted it to do to respond are the National Fraud Squad and the National Fraud Intelligence Unit. And you'll remember, because we
keep deflecting away from action fraud. All I want to know is why it is that something that's so important is being delayed.
Madam Chair, forgive me, I'm not deflecting away. What I'm saying is that action fraud is one element within a wider strategy.
About it.
And forgive me?
I'm asking you about that one element. I understand all the rest. But I'm asking you, as the Minister responsible, why is action fraud in its revamped all singing, all dancing model, why is that not up and running? Why are we having to wait until the end of the year?
The thing is, what I'm explaining is that it is up and running largely. It's not rebranded, that's certainly true, but it is up and running, because the things that action fraud brings together is the ability to respond to fraud. Now, that's the National Fraud Squad. It's the training of the different fraud leads in various police forces. That's 100 extra police officers who we are hiring at the moment. It's the National Fraud Intelligence Unit, which is already up and running. All of these sit behind the brand that is Action Fraud. So you're right in saying that the brand could do with a change, and that's what we're working with the City of London Police on. But the capabilities that it brings together are being updated even now, even without the brand change.
Okay, but I still don't understand or have an answer as to why there's a delay. We were told on the 28th of February the system will now be operational from later this year.
But forgive me, but it is operational. It's just operational under an existing brand rather than under a new brand.
Okay, sorry, I'm really confused now because we were told by the end of the year there'd be a new system of action fraud that would work better. So you're saying it's already in operation?
Well, a lot of it is. The
but
National
why
Fraud
isn't
Squad.
all of it, is my question to you, Minister.
Because it requires a lot of cooperation across police forces.
Yes.
And we're working on getting that in place. Sorry?
Sorry, what is the problem with the police forces? They're not responding to you? What's the issue?
All of them have many, many priorities. You don't need me to tell you this. They have many, many priorities, and we're bringing them together. It just takes time.
Lawton.
Mr. Tugendhat, to come back to closer to home for your responsibility, what came out of the summit of the last 2 days as regards the link between fraud and financing of terrorism?
The summit didn't focus so much on that. That we'd normally do in a more closed setting. The summit that we just had in Lancaster House was much more to do with the connection between social media, tech companies, telecoms companies, and law enforcement and government in making sure that we kept each other's population safe. It was largely, as one of the executives pointed out, the victim nations who were assembled rather than the nations who very often harbour fraudsters, but it was that's what it was bringing together.
Okay, so what is happening as regard combating fraud, which is financing terrorism, that is disclosable, that wasn't discussed in the last 2 days' summit?
So there's an awful lot that we're doing on that. I mean, in many ways, it doesn't really require to be discussed separately because of the same techniques that lead to money going to terrorists or criminal groups or drugs groups or whatever it happens to be. It doesn't. The technique isn't the important bit. The participant in that sense isn't the important bit. It's the technique, and what we're trying to interrupt is the technique in order to make sure that the monies don't go to criminal groups, whether they're terrorist or whatever they happen to be. And so the work that we were doing over the last 2 days, and indeed have done over many months, as you know, before, are all about trying to interrupt that flow of money and making sure that the various ranges of interruption that we can put in, whether it's awareness at the earliest stage where a victim simply doesn't comply with an early request, or whether it's interruption by technical means or indeed by the bank finally blocking a payment, that's what we were working on.
What successful interruptions have there been for combating finance going to terrorist organisations abroad?
I don't have those figures with me, but there's been an awful lot of interruption of fraud over the last few years, and that's why we're able to say that fraud is down. And to the Chair's position, the exact figures are very hard to be certain of, but according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, it's 13%.
Does fraud by terrorist organisations based in Syria, Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries get featured in the crime survey for the UK? It probably doesn't, does it? Mrs Miggins of 1 Acacia Avenue, Warrington, isn't going to make any comment about how her funds have fraudulently gone to finance Al-Qaeda or other organisations. It's surely not part of that survey.
Well, she may not know, but the fact that she's reported a fraud would in fact qualify under the Crime Survey of England and Wales, whoever the beneficiary was.
Yes, okay. So how do we know, as you've just stated, that fraud across the board has gone down? We'll take your word for it. How do we know that...
Well, you don't have to take my word for it. It was the Crime Survey of England and Wales. It's
yes,
not.
But as we've just discovered in the conversation with the chair, that's largely contingent on what's actually being reported, not what is actually taking place.
Might I just interrupt on this particular point about reporting and the crime survey. So just to be clear, the crime survey is a statistical sample of 30,000 individuals across England and Wales. So it's a representative sample. So it doesn't suffer from underreporting issues because it's deliberately designed to give the full picture. The underreporting issue pertains to action fraud, where about sort of 15% of frauds actually get reported to action fraud. But that doesn't impact on our ability to understand the total volume of fraud, which is a very accurate measure through, as the Minister says, through the crime survey of England and Wales. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so let's have some examples of how fraud has been used to finance overseas terrorist organisations.
Do I have some examples? I think there were a few examples which were provided in the fraud strategy, and there certainly are examples of that happening. I think
such as how does it happen? How could some of my money, if I've been defrauded, ending up with Al-Qaeda or whoever it may be? How do you judge that it's ended up with terrorist organisations?
I wouldn't speak to a specific case, but generally the mechanism through which fraud money is moved around the world is through money muling networks, and often many hundreds of accounts connected together, and the money moves all around the world, and will end up ultimately, often cashed out through cryptocurrencies, can end up with organised criminals or with terrorists. So, I would say that the evidence that I've seen certainly doesn't imply a huge volume of terrorist financing connected to fraud. That's the evidence.
So you don't think that terrorism is a major beneficiary of funding from fraudulent activity?
I've not seen intelligence to suggest it's a major issue. Though it undoubtedly does happen, but I've not seen...
what proportion is it then, roughly?
I'm not necessarily going to get into proportions because I'm not sure the intelligence is strong enough to get to that level, but I can say that our assessments where we've worked with law enforcement don't suggest it is a major source.
So the evidence from intelligence reports that I've seen is certainly with regard to Middle Eastern terrorist organisations. During the Caliphate, for example, the three major sources of funding came from drug trading, antiquities trading, and online fraud and other forms of fraud. You're saying that actually the fraudulent part of that was pretty minor.
I think the point I'm making about is the total volume of fraud affecting the UK. We've talked about the scale. It's quite enormous. The proportion of that which is going to terrorist financing, I've not seen intelligence suggest that's a large proportion of the total volume of fraud.
Where's the evidence to suggest that?
Well, the evidence is in the work that we do with the National Crime Agency in particular, who have an assessment of the sources of fraud impacting on the UK. So those assessments that I've worked with.
When the National Crime Agency appeared in front of us recently to tell us that terrorism was closely linked with fraud, they were crying wolf, were they?
I don't know what.
Sorry, I wouldn't say that they were crying wolf. I'd say that the way in which we look at terrorist financing is from the other end of the telescope. So what we are discussing here is the perpetration of fraud against victims. So individuals losing sums of money anywhere from a few pounds to many, many thousands of pounds. The difference is when one looks at the other end of the spectrum, one sees currencies coming in from, as you rightly said, trading of illicit and illegal goods, or indeed from money transfers from different agencies, very often through cryptocurrencies and so on. Now, seeing that money coming in may or may not be connected to fraud, but the effort that's put in there is to block the transfer of money very often rather than the origin of the money. So if Bitcoin is going into Raqqa for one reason or another, then the aim of our services is to stop that finance getting into Raqqa, whether it's come from drug dealing or theft or fraud or perfectly lawful sales and charitable contributions. It doesn't really matter. We don't want that money going into Raqqa, and we will seek to interrupt it. We'll also do some analysis on where that money comes from, and so if there is links between fraud and, sales of certain products or whatever it happens to be, then we may get into that as well. But I'm afraid that's not what I don't think that's what Duncan was suggesting. He was merely suggesting that from a UK fraud perspective, the scale of fraud is sadly large. and a very small percentage of that large-scale fraud is going into terrorism, not the other way around, where the proportion of money going to terrorism may be disproportionately coming from fraud.
Okay, let's come closer to home, where we might have some more detail on stats. Minister Vere, I think the committee has struggled to understand how joined up combating fraud is between government departments and agencies, and where the buck stops. So the Treasury has responsibility for money laundering.
Yep.
And the Home Office has lead responsibility for fraud.
Yep.
With obviously a lot of overlap between the two. So how does it work in terms of joint working, information exchange, etc.?
Yeah, very, very simple. I'll explain that. So the overarching strategy is Economic Crime Plan 2, which covers 2023 to 2026. This is the second version of that plan. It has three outcomes. The first being to reduce money laundering and improve asset recovery. The second is to combat kleptocracy and sanctions evasion. And the third is to cut fraud. And going back to your previous question, of course, it is all interrelated. If you're trying to get money from the UK to Iraq or whatever, it's always interrelated. You've got money laundering in the middle there. So it all has to fit together and work nicely together. There are 146 actions in Action Plan, in the ECP2, some of which fall in the Home Office, some of which sit in Treasury, and of course there's a governance structure which sits around that plan. I have a really nice schematic here, which I might send to you after the evidence session, unless you've already seen it. But at its heart is the Economic Crime Strategic Board, which is the Chancellor and the Home Secretary, who basically very much sort of check the strategic direction within the economic crime world. The thing that I'm particularly struck by, and Tom and I did one very recently, was the Joint Fraud Task Force. It's when we bring together law enforcement, we bring together the private sector, we bring together NGOs. It's all about having those conversations about, what are we taking forward, particularly in the fraud space. There's an Economic Crime Delivery Board, there's a Public-Private Steering Group. There's lots of different things, because the Economic Crime Plan, the key thing about it is that it brings together the public and the private sector. The government cannot do this on our own. We have to put the right incentives in place for the private sector, and that's what the system does. So I do think we have a good way of working together. Could it be improved? Quite possibly.
Should we have an overarching minister with cross-departmental responsibilities, as we do in other cases, with a lead on fraud?
I think Tom and I are perfectly capable.
Can I say that I think it works better with the two of us than it would do if there was a single minister? And the reason I say this is because, yes, of course, there's an obligation on us to work together, and there's no question about that. We do have to work very closely together. But our departments are actually looking at different things and have experience of different things. And it's quite right that the Home Office focuses on individuals, on police forces, on victims, on the criminality of it. And it's quite right that the Treasury focuses on the finance aspects of it, the movement of money, the banking, the enabling architecture, if you like. And the combination of the two makes it better. I feel it's a little sort of Roman Carthage. I mean, it's possible that you can teach the Romans to swim, but the Carthaginians demonstrated they were more able to take the land.
Yeah, but the Carthaginians lost. So, I mean, that's all very well if there's a good exchange of information between the Home Office and the
and there is.
Treasury.
And look at Duncan and Anna are both here, demonstrating there.
Okay, well, I'm sure they're very impressive, but the presence of two civil servants doesn't mean that the whole system is working.
The reality is the Joint Fraud Task Force is a very good indicator.
Can we come back to bank accounts? So one of the things that again has puzzled us, and we've had a number of witnesses from the financial community, is a lot of fraud happens by people being conned out of transferring money into a fraudster's bank account, which then gets cleared out. Given how difficult it is to set up a new bank account, and if you're an MP, virtually impossible because of all the money laundering requirements, which have become more and more intensive, and that you virtually have to produce your blood group and various other lifestyle evidence before you're allowed to even start the process of setting up a bank account. How is it that bank accounts established by people who commit fraud, using those bank accounts as vessels to gain that money, are able to exist? And why are the banks and other financial institutions responsible for setting up those bank accounts able to trace those people who've then committed fraud using their bank accounts?
Sorry.
Well, it's a Treasury question, I think.
Yes, it is.
Let me start, Tom, and you can fill in the gaps. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about, from a politically exposed person perspective, which I presume is what you're referring to as a Member of Parliament. We did lay an SI towards the end of last year.
Not interested in that. This is ordinary people being conned with fraud. I purely said how difficult it is for anybody to set up a bank account, most of all us, but we're not committing fraud, hopefully, otherwise we wouldn't be here.
No. It depends what sort of bank account you want, because, of course, the 9 largest bank account providers are obliged to provide a basic account to people, provided they pass the due diligence checks and there is no suspicion of fraud. So I'm sorry, I'm being slightly dim. I'm not entirely sure what your question is.
Okay, so the question is, how can, if I was a fraudster,
yes,
I have to provide my credentials to Barclays Bank to set up a bank account.
Sure.
I, as a fraudster, then by impersonating somebody from Barclays Bank or whatever, get Mrs. Miggins of Acacia Avenue to transfer her life savings into that bank account which I have set up,
yes,
which I then empty and disappear.
Right.
If I have had to provide my identity and credentials, which have been tried and tested by Barclays as they are required to do under all sorts of money laundering regulations, how is it that they cannot then trace me to report me to the police in order for them to retrieve Mrs. Miggins' money?
At that point, and I'm going to then slide into Tom, the bank would provide the details to the police.
Can I say,
They don't, because it turns out that those people don't exist or they've given fraudulent identities, which means the bank has not done its due diligence. So the Financial Conduct Authority, presumably, is the responsible regulator for stepping in to make sure that the banks are doing their due diligence, and that shouldn't happen. Given that the FCA employs an awful lot of people, it costs £780 million to run, how does that happen?
Well, the FCA absolutely is responsible for making sure that the banks do their checks, and if there is a systemic failure within a bank to fulfil their due diligence, then of course there would be penalties levied against them.
Okay, such as?
Well, there are all sorts of levels of written warnings, fines, penalties, disclosures, all those sorts of things. The normal penalties that the FCA would normally...
Are you the Minister responsible for the FCA?
Well, they're an independent regulator.
Yes, but they come under a government department.
Well, they're an independent regulator, actually, so they're accountable to Parliament.
Yes, but there's a responsible department who oversees them as the intermediary between Parliament and that regulator.
Yes, but we are committed to the independent... So what happens...
No, but you're the sponsoring department for any regulations and legislation affecting the Financial Conduct Authority.
So Parliament
Are you that minister or not?
No.
Who is?
Tim Aflami.
Right.
But Parliament sets the legislative framework in which the FCA operates. We have no operational control over the FCA.
In terms of their responsibility in cracking down on fraud, they're pretty important, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
How many companies do they regulate?
It depends under which legislative regime, so it depends.
I think it's around 50,000.
It is 50,000, isn't it? Do you know how many prosecutions there were in the last 12?
For what for, though? Again, what for?
For fraud?
No. Because what happens is the FCA has no express power to prosecute fraud. What they would do, they would usually only prosecute if it was furthering their statutory objectives. What would happen is they would then pass the intelligence on to law enforcement, and what often then happens is the law enforcement then take that forward.
Yes, but they investigate. So how many investigations have the FCA got at the moment?
I don't know. Do you know?
It is a very limited number. Yeah, and I think the FCA gave some evidence to you where you probed them on this a few weeks ago. And if I recall, their answers were that they were really focused on the supervision and the prevention, and that they used their kind of prosecuting powers quite a limited way. I wonder whether this links to a kind of wider point about prosecutions across the piece, which Home Office may also be.
Well, it's not prosecutions, and that's why I'm slightly surprised, Minister, that you don't know those figures, not least because they were covered in the last session we had, and one would have thought as a Minister you would have read the transcript from the last session. And a really big concern that came out of that session is that a lot of this fraud and certainly the volume fraud, the Mrs. Miggins fraud, which Action Fraud has not been terribly successful in pursuing, is happening through the use of bank accounts that theoretically should not be able to be used on the scale that they are. And we have a huge organisation, the Financial Conduct Authority, which seems to have the time and resources on its hand at the moment to investigate all sorts of diversity quotas amongst its 50,000 members, but appears only to be able to muster 190 live investigations at the moment out of an organisation that regulates over 50,000 businesses employing millions of people, of which there are thousands and thousands of instances of fraud, because it represents 40% of all crime in this country. So FCA seems not to be doing its job very well, does it?
Well, I don't know if, unless you go into the detail of the 100 and however many investigations, I don't think you can say that. How can you say that?
Well, because, as I've just said, this is 40% of crime figures in this country.
How many bank accounts? How many retail banks are there that really have a volume of bank accounts in the country? Not many. So if those 141 investigations are focused on those people who provide the bank accounts, then I suspect they're doing their job great.
It's 190 investigations, and who are they against then?
Well, I don't know, because we do not have operational control over the FCA. We do not do that. No. They're an independent regulator.
Okay. You've just said that if the FCA regulates the financial sector, which has got 50,000 firms, they are the firms who provide bank accounts. Most fraud...
No, that's not true. That's not
true. Who else provides bank accounts that's not regulated by the FCA?
A group of them provide bank accounts. Not all of them provide bank accounts.
No, but everybody who provides bank accounts in the UK just about is covered by the FCA.
Yes, correct. But it's only, what's 10 largest... the 9 largest have to provide basic bank accounts, and they cover the vast majority of the market.
Well, it's irrelevant, though. There's 190 live investigations. It might be 189 of them against one firm and one against a smaller firm. It may be against 190 different firms. That's not the point. Well, you don't know, and I don't know. The point is there are only 190 investigations going on. Only 10 people have been prosecuted, and yet there are 50,000 firms where much more of this fraudulent activity, be it through the use of mules or whatever, is going on, and it's not being traced. And yet you've got the FCA with a budget of £780 million, surely should be doing more investigation. Where is that fraud happening otherwise?
Those 50,000 firms are, they're credit brokers, they're sort of small lenders, and, I think this sort of point that the number of firms that have banking licences and are providing bank accounts is a small subset of that 50,000.
Yes, it doesn't just happen through banking accounts as well. It happens through loans that are fraudulently engineered too. So most of those businesses regulated have some capacity to be vehicles for various sorts of fraud. The surprise of this committee was that the reach of the FCA, which is a large organisation, seems to be very limited in an area which is the largest single responsibility for crime in the UK, and where the use of bank accounts to facilitate that crime should not be happening if they are fulfilling their money laundering obligations as they should be. Is that not a fair analysis?
I think, for me, it is a question that you rightly pose to the FCA. They are an independent regulator. We give them statutory objectives, and that they put together a strategy for best pursuing those objectives. And I think what they would have said to you is that their strategy is focused, given the large population, on supervision of institutions and trying to ensure that the systems and processes that are in place across the system are robust, and uses sort of individual prosecutions fairly sparingly because of the expense and the impact that they think that provides compared to other areas.
And it's an expense consideration that they've only got 190 investigations.
Well, I think it is an efficiency consideration.
But again, I don't see how you can say 190 investigations is too many, too few, unless you know substantially what those investigations are. It's impossible to draw that conclusion.
No, but the more relevant statistic is that hundreds of thousands of fraudulent crimes are being committed each year,
Right.
And in a very substantial number of them, it involves the use of financial vehicles, which are offered by companies which are regulated by the FCA. So they are only analysing a very, very small fraction of fraudulent cases going through financial institutions, it would appear. Otherwise, how do you explain it?
It depends what the investigations are.
Okay, well, I think we've probably exhausted that because you're saying that's the problem that you've got with being able to answer.
I think the final question is, are you happy that FCA is an effective regulator and is doing everything that it is capable of doing to clamp down on financial fraud?
I am content that the FCA is an effective regulator. I haven't heard people complain that they are not, but I would focus actually on what the FCA does to prevent fraud in the first place. For them, it is much more about prevention and intervention along the process of fraud. I think your focus on bank accounts, I absolutely accept it, and I hope that the FCA took that message away, and I hope that they are very, very clear about what they've got to do for the big retail banks. But as I say, they are an independent regulator. They are not under the direction of the Treasury. Under direction, they report to Parliament, and they obviously are accountable in select committees, etc. That is what Parliament itself decided we would do for our financial regulators.
If the government decided it was not doing its job properly, it is for the government to bring forward changes in terms of regulations or legislation to change the way the FCA operates. So it is independent, but it is ultimately marshalled and scrutinised not just by Parliament, but by the sponsoring department, which is the Treasury.
But we feel that they have the appropriate amount of powers. There is no lack of powers here. It is a question of operationalising them. But I would also point out that the FCA, if it comes to money laundering, the FCA is but one of 22 supervisors. And it is, again, there are organisations who are not under the remit of the FCA who would be involved or could be involved in money laundering and terrorist financing. So it is a very large ecosystem. The FCA does some of it, HMRC does some of it, and then there's
thank
lots
you.
of others.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I ask how much money was raised by the economic crime levy?
About £80 million.
Okay, so it is a shortfall than
yes,
the government expected.
And as when we introduced the economic crime levy, we said that we might have to make changes because you can never quite know when you introduce a new levy exactly how much it's going to raise. There is a shortfall, and as you know, we've now increased it in the last budget.
You've doubled it from 250,000 to 500,000.
Only for the largest businesses with revenues over £1 billion.
Yeah. Did the department get the sums wrong on how much you thought you would raise, or have companies tried to avoid paying into that levy?
No, it was just one of those things where we were absolutely clear when we introduced it that there might need to be changes made depending on whether too much was raised or too little.
Okay. How much do you expect to raise given the increase?
I think we expect to raise about 110.
Okay.
So I think we've slightly gone over after the increase to make sure that, obviously, we need to make sure that it's fully funded.
And when will you know if you've made that money in?
After people have paid.
I just wondered if you had a date in mind of when you expected to receive the funds for that levy.
No, because it's paid in arrears. Yes, so obviously we just put it up and it's paid in arrears.
Some of the concerns that we've had from people throughout this inquiry is that the UK isn't spending enough on tackling economic crime. A figure that I have is that the UK only spends 0.042% of GDP to tackle economic crime, and less than 1% of UK police resource is spent on tackling fraud. Is that enough?
I don't think it's about the money spent. I think it is about the outcomes. And, the economic crime plan is very, very much focused on outcomes, because one of the things that we are very clear about in the economic crime plan is this is not just about government can never be. So that figure does not include what the private sector is using, all of their compliance departments, all of the structures that they have in place. So it can never be just up to the government to fix this. So I'm content that we are spending an appropriate amount. It's actually a very ambitious plan, and frankly, it's world-leading.
Well, there's significantly more economic crime being committed than the resource going towards it. police forces are not spending, if they're spending about 1% of police resource on a crime that is far larger than that, surely they're not going to be able to tackle economic crime.
I don't understand why
the resources don't
connection.
seem to me to be following the crime.
Do you have to comment on that?
I'd be delighted. This isn't just a policing operation, as you've already rightly identified. And the reality is that what we're seeing policing interacting at certain points in this process. The most important thing here is to prevent individuals becoming victims, and in many areas that's where policing would be put forward. So, for example, public order or burglary or things like that, having police on the streets may have a deterrent effect. This is one of those areas where it doesn't have that deterrent effect, and actually what it is about the investigatory effect. And so you're looking at policing in a slightly different way here, and that's why the important thing is not the raw numbers or indeed the quantum of sums. It's the way in which policing works with business and works with other intelligence capabilities. So, for example, the National Fraud Intelligence Unit draws on the intelligence capabilities of the wider government. Now, they don't come, the monies come from the NCSC or from GCHQ, are not part of that figure, nor is the contribution made by Meta or by HSBC or by any number of other businesses part of that figure, excuse me. But I would argue that they are significantly more important in many ways than the raw number of police officers or the raw number of individuals being put onto fraud, because it's only by looking at the whole thing together that you can see whether or not you're having the right effect. Now, could we be doing more? Well, yes, but that's where a lot of international cooperation is so important. But I think that it is certainly true to say that we are beginning to have an effect already. Now, that's the 13% down on the crime survey of England and Wales. I can only assume it's similar in Scotland. I'm afraid I don't have the data for Scotland for different reasons of calculation, which you know very well. But it's certainly true that we are seeing a greater effect. Now, where do we need to put work in? Well, we need to put work into cooperation with some of those countries that are not victim countries, but countries where perpetrators, sadly, are based. And we need to put work into making sure that a wider and greater number of companies cooperate. But that's why yesterday's summit was so important, and indeed why the online fraud charter is so important.
The distinct impression that we had from witnesses that we heard early on in this inquiry is that the police don't take this seriously at all, particularly when it comes to romance fraud, and I'll give you an example of that. So Anna Rowe, who set up the organisation Lovesaid, went to the police after being abused by a person on Tinder. She said they were very convincing, they were manipulative, but when she went to the police, they said, "So your boyfriend lied to you, what do you want us to do?" She did her own investigation and found 17 other victims of this fraud. Why are police not seeing this as a priority?
So you're absolutely right that this is something that wasn't taken seriously, is increasingly being taken seriously, because you're completely correct that 10, 15 years ago, people didn't see these as serious at all, and then it's been growing in importance, and some police forces have seen it as more important at different points, and that's why we're putting so much effort into this, because you're completely correct that romance fraud is nothing to do with romance. It's another form of swindling. It's just another form of fraud, and we need to treat it as criminal activity in the same way as we treat anything else. Now, if you're saying, and you'd be completely correct, that all police forces need to treat it in the same way, that's exactly right. That's why we launched the National Fraud Squad, which, as you know, is now fully staffed at 400 officers. That's why we launched the National Fraud Intelligence Unit under the fraud strategy. And that's why we're leading on the online fraud charter, and that's why we're leading on the Global Fraud Summit. I'm afraid romance fraud, not exclusively cross-border, but a large element of it is cross-border, and very often includes countries under which where we'd find it very hard to get a prosecution.
Yes. Well, some of those people that committed frauds like that are still out there continuing to...
Yes, they are, but very often they're in jurisdictions where we have no reach.
Louise Baxter from Trading Standards spoke about this kind of online fraud as being organised crime because it involves grooming, it involves data sharing by the criminals and bespoke targeting of people who are considered to be, by the fraudsters, to be vulnerable. Those people might not consider themselves vulnerable. So what more can be done to support those people?
If I may, this is one of those interesting phrases that I'm slightly cautious of, because vulnerability suggests older people or people who may be in some... And the reality...
Mr. talked about situational vulnerability.
Right, exactly right. Sorry, forgive me.
Term.
It's a much better term. And the reason it's a better term is because actually vulnerability can be a younger person who is very, very used to doing stuff online. and therefore is much more trusting of an online process. You mentioned Tinder. More young people use Tinder today than they did when I was at university, and largely on the basis it didn't exist. Exactly right. But so it's certainly a change in environment that makes that situational vulnerability you correctly highlight. And there's been a perception, and one I'm sure you'd agree, an incorrect perception that fraud particularly affects older people or people living alone or whatever it is. It's simply not true. It affects everybody, and that situational vulnerability is really interesting and very. This is where the work of the National Fraud Intelligence Unit, alongside companies like Meta, is so important, because actually a lot of this is psychological, and a lot of this is to do with the various different ways in which fraud happens. I mean, we've all received those emails promising us, X million pounds if we, respond to whatever, and we assume they're a joke. Well, they're not a joke. They're actually a way of fraudsters narrowing down their need to target individuals. Because if you don't if you don't interact with them at all, that's easy. The fraudster hasn't wasted their time. If you do interact, then you may be already demonstrating a level of credibility in something that is fraudulent that will enable them to decide that you are a better, as you rightly put it, situationally vulnerable target. And so there's a huge amount of psychological work that needs to go into it, and that's why the intelligence lead is so important.
Are all of the tech and social media companies, I mean, you talk about online dating or Facebook or Microsoft or whoever, are they all taking enough responsibility in your view?
No,
what needs to happen?
So the reality is some are, and you'll have seen the Online Fraud Charter, and you'll have seen who signed up to it and the ways in which they have signed up to it. And there are companies that have not signed up to it. We're having conversations with them, but let's be clear. This is the first time any country in the world has introduced an online fraud charter. It's the first time any of these companies have signed up to recognise their responsibility for what's going on their platforms. So these are really big innovations, really big changes. It's not entirely surprising, therefore, that not everybody has signed up or everybody's at the same pace. But yeah, there's more to do.
And even for those that have signed up, it's voluntary. They could walk away and there would be no consequence.
They could. The reputational damage for doing so, now that they've accepted responsibility, I would suggest is significantly greater.
And they don't seem terribly bothered about reputational damage, in my view, because I've had representatives in front of committees before from Meta at various points. They didn't acknowledge things like the TSB, for example, had found that a third of Facebook Marketplace ads were fraudulent. They wouldn't accept that. So
this is where the conversations need to go further, bluntly. And there are some companies, and I would argue Google is one of these, that has recognised its responsibility through, for example, the regulation. They've made sure that you cannot advertise on their UK platform any investment products that are not FCA regulated, and that has reduced what was about 20% of online fraud in the United Kingdom. I think, was it 20% of fraud or 20% of online fraud? I think it was 20% of online fraud, wasn't it? I'll have to check the statistic, forgive me. But Google accounted for a large section of fraud in the United Kingdom, and when they implemented that very simple rule, it went to zero. Now, that does demonstrate that there's quite a lot that online tech companies could do if they chose to do it. And this is where you're absolutely right. We need to be increasing the pressure. But I think there are reasons to be encouraged at the direction of travel, if not at the end state.
There's rules coming in around advertised paid-for content, but not user-generated content on social media platforms. Is that a big loophole?
I'm sorry, forgive me.
There's regulations coming in the online safety field around paid-for content. So if I put on an ad on a social media platform, then I'm expected to comply. If I just user-generate content and put it out into the world and I'm not paying for it, there's nothing that they can do about that.
This is, I mean, you'll appreciate this as well as me. That's where the challenge of freedom of speech kicks in, because if you're advertising a good versus you're having a conversation with somebody about an idea, you're dealing with a different human interaction. And I take your point. It is, the reality is, yes, it's a different interaction, but I think it's right that as a government that we look at regulating those areas where paid for content is clearly a business transaction rather than a human interaction, which is slightly different. Now, does that mean there's a vulnerability? Well, there's a vulnerability with all human interaction, but I think what we're doing here is we're taking the reasonable steps that are correct to take to keep people safe within a context of freedom of speech.
Okay. On a slightly different note, can I ask, what's your opinion? Do you think UK corporate structures are facilitating fraud, and what can be done about that?
Not per se. I mean, if you're telling me that there are some fraudulent companies in the UK, of course there are. And we're working to close them down, to find them and to arrest those who are responsible. But not as a structure, no.
And we'd give an example of during
Sure.
COVID, there was a company in my constituency, the employees expected to get furlough payments. The company had set up a payroll company separately, had got the COVID furlough payments. The employees never saw any of that. That's a corporate structure set up to avoid responsibility to your employees.
So, I would argue that's not only criminal, but incredibly irresponsible behaviour to individuals who were presumably extremely vulnerable to financial hardship at a time when the country was suffering. So I think that's grossly immoral and deeply irresponsible.
It's not uncommon to set up payroll companies to avoid obligations.
It's unusual to set up payroll companies to avoid obligations. It's normal to set up payroll companies to enable different financial and fiscal liabilities, but that's not the same thing.
So one of the concerns I've had for a long time is the way in which these corporate structures can be used for avoiding the rules that are in place to try and protect people. Would you be... I had it highlighted to me just this week that HMRC are still authorising a trust and company service provider whose only known clients are sanctioned Russians.
I'll take that if I may, and certainly, if you want to send me details of that, I'll make sure that HMRC gets it, because obviously we should. Everybody is very clear about who should be talking to designated or interacting with designated persons and this under the sanctions regime. Can I just quickly return to your point, though, that you made about the corporate structure? I'm not entirely sure that the corporate structure is at fault here. It is people committing fraud. And HMRC...
Those structures allow people to do that?
Well, you can set up a company, but are you saying that...
There's companies and the people that are supposed to be the persons of significant control. There's all of these rules that have been put in place that are not being adhered to, which is allowing all of this stuff to happen in the background.
Of course, and you will have seen the Companies House reforms that are coming in, and Companies House... I think, I've got an interesting stat here where, 6 years ago, they would have 10 investigations at any one time. Now they have about 900 cases a month. Companies House is being resourced to be far more...
We're increasing that too.
Yeah, and we're increasing it. So they're being resourced to be far more proactive in terms of company structures, and under the ECCTA Act, whatever it was called, there are reforms being done to Companies House. But in terms of the fundamental problem here, whoever set up that company was committing a fraud. And HMRC spent £100 million on the Taxpayer Protection Task Force over a 2-year period to recover, and they actually protected £1.6 billion by doing that. But I fundamentally agree, it is wrong.
There's a new set of frauds being perpetrated against people. So people are being registered as company directors without their knowledge or consent.
Yes.
What is happening to follow those kind of crimes up as well? So there's a researcher, Graham Barrow, who's done a lot of work on this, and people without any knowledge whatsoever, because it's not an obligation of Companies House to check these things, have ended up being victims as a result.
So that's where the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act will kick in. It's the work that Kevin Hollingrake in the Department of Business and Trade has been leading on. Because you're absolutely right. The old story that Mickey Mouse was a director of I don't know how many companies. I mean, those stories that were out there. And it's absolutely essential that Companies House is more than just simply a dumb register, if you've seen it, just a sort of list of data. A data dump, but is actually more than that, and that's what the ECCT Act does in order to exactly prevent that sort of offence, and that's why we've empowered it. We've given it the ability to investigate and the resources to do so.
I mean, it seems to be that the fraudsters and the enablers are always a few steps ahead of where government is on this, and which is why I asked the question to Mr Ephgrave about the resources that government departments, agencies have to tackle this. It's difficult to keep, to recruit in the first place and keep those specialist staff when they can be snapped up by the private sector and also by the fraudsters if they pay them enough money as well.
Well, I'd be cautious of going down that line on the grounds that there's some people of very high integrity who are working in these outlets.
But in the past, one of the police departments had talked about they have specialists on online fraud. They can't keep them because they'll go off to the private sector.
This is where I come back to a point I made earlier. This is where the interaction between public and private and law enforcement is so important, because you're entirely right that organisations like Meta are likely to be able to pay more than Police Scotland or City of London Police or whoever it is. But it's also true that the City of London Police and Police Scotland, whoever else it is, have the ability to do things that a private company can't do. And that investigatory capability is hugely interesting, it's hugely challenging, it demands an awful lot of the individuals who pursue it. And alongside the partnership in some of the technical skills that some of the companies offer, means that we can actually have a whole of society response, not just a government response. And I think that's really important because, we've quite rightly, and you're absolutely right, to focus on government's responsibility in all of this. And of course it's true that, as Security Minister in the Treasury, we have responsibility. Of course we do. But so does everybody. And this is where, to Mr. Lawton's point about, banks issuing bank accounts or to do with online...
I think we're straying slightly off, and I'm just conscious it's Prime Minister's question time in 15 minutes. So I think if you want to respond directly to the point that Alison was raising, because I think you were rather drifting off into a broader picture.
Sure. Well, my view is that this is a whole of society response, and I think Ms. Hewlett has asked a very reasonable question on that, and we all have a responsibility to play our part. And it's certainly true that some offer more interesting career paths and some offer more lucrative career paths, and sometimes they overlap, but often they don't.
Okay. Because we're very short on time, I wondered, could you write to the committee about the issue of 1% of police resources being used to deal with fraud? I think we are of the view that that is insufficient, and we'd welcome your consideration of that and what it should be at, what kind of percentage it should be at. Could you also let us know your view on the issue of social media platforms doing more to protect consumers from fraud occurring on their sites? And that's particularly around this issue of reimbursing victims of advanced push payment fraud, because we know for the majority of financial firms they will have to do that.
You'd like me to write about this?
Sorry?
Would you like me to write about this?
I want you to write to me about
Very
this,
happy
yes,
to,
please.
yes.
And also, on your latest anti-fraud public awareness campaign, Stop Think Fraud, could you let us know what evaluation you're using to see what the effect of that campaign is? Because there's some issues about that.
Very happy
so
to
if you could write to me with those three answers, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
To all of you for attending today, and I hope you feel better, Minister, very soon.
My apologies for...
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended.